Amen. Amen. 1 Timothy chapter 3 for our study this morning. One of the awesome privileges that we have as Christians is to rightly represent God before the world. We're told over in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that we are ambassadors of Christ. And really, an ambassador is nothing more than a representative of his own homeland or government. And so really what we are is we are ambassadors of the kingdom of God. And as representatives of Jesus Christ, it's quite true that people will often form their opinions about God and Christianity based upon what they see in our lives. Came across an interesting story that illustrates that point. It's from Chuck Swindoll, who talks about a pastor's conference where pastors were standing in a line in a hotel lobby to check into their hotel rooms for the conference. And since it was a rather nice and fancy hotel, well, some of the people waiting in the line to check in turned out not to be pastors. The clerk was so busy getting everybody registered in their rooms that he would automatically ask each person as they checked in if they were a pastor. That way he could put them in the right section of the hotel that was blocked out or reserved for the conference. Now the man standing in line in front of Chuck Swindoll happened not to be a pastor. And after waiting several minutes in line, finally he reached the check-in desk when the clerk quickly looked up and said, "Are you a preacher?" And the man just kind of hung his head down and said, "No, I'm just having a bad day. That's why I look like this." He had obviously formed an opinion of Christianity, hadn't he? True story. That man's opinion was obvious that Christians are killjoys. Christians are sourpusses. Christians are, like the Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh. And no doubt he had formed that opinion based on what he had been impressed with or what he had seen from Christians around him at the workplace or in the neighborhood or in the supermarket, who knows. But we are to represent Jesus Christ rightly and properly. For maybe you remember the story of one man who didn't back in the book of Numbers in chapter 20. In Numbers chapter 20, we read the account of how Moses misrepresented God. Remember the story? The children of Israel had been wandering in the wilderness for many years now. They come to this place called Meribah. Now, they'd been there before, earlier on in their wilderness wanderings, and as was true of their case, they just seemed to keep going in circles. Ended up back at the same place they'd been some years earlier, and in true Hebrew children form, they were grumbling, and they were murmuring, and they were complaining, "Moses, why have you brought us out here, that we might die? We're thirsty, Moses. We want a drinking fountain, Moses. Take care of our need." Moses goes before God and says, "Help, Lord." And the Lord says to Moses, "Moses, I want you to speak to the rock, and water will come forth, and the people will be refreshed." And so after talking to God about the situation, Moses goes out there, and with his rod, with his staff, he strikes the rock. And water comes out by the grace of God. But then God calls Moses aside. Because you see, the reason that Moses struck the rock was he had had it up to here with these people. I mean, have you ever been on a long road trip, mom and dad, and the brothers and sisters in the back seat, are we there yet? I got to go potty. I'm hungry. He touched me. And all that. Hey, I was there. I remember that as a kid. I mean, my grandparents always put me on the end of the bench seat so that there was only one kid in the car I could touch instead of two. I was a provoker, man. I was a troublemaker in my younger days, and my grandparents knew how to take care of that. But that's what Moses was experiencing with the children of Israel, and by now he was up to here with it, to where in his anger and his frustration he hits the rock, and God says, "Mo, we got to talk, bud." He says, "I'm not angry with these people. You are. You've misrepresented me before them, Moses, and because you have done that, you're not going to get to go into the promised land." I mean, he came that close. Can you imagine it? 40 years. 40 years he wandered with this sniveling, whining bunch of sheep. And when the horizon is looming and the promised land is beckoning, Moses blows it at the last minute and God says, "No, you're not going." Oh, man. That's why I want to be especially careful in the latter years of ministry that I don't blow it, lest I get that close and miss out on the reward. Another example of someone who misrepresented God, and you remember this story well, and it's found in the books of Samuel. A man named King David. You remember David's story. David got involved in, a compromising situation. He ended up committing adultery with Bathsheba, and worse yet, trying to cover his tracks, he had her husband murdered on the battlefield. And you remember that when the prophet Nathan came to confront David over his sin, after pointing his finger and saying, "You're the man," fingering the king for his sinful conduct, he went on to say to David, "Because of what you have done, you have given the enemies of God an opportunity and occasion to blaspheme." And that's what happens when we misrepresent the Lord. Who will ever forget the black eye dealt to the Christian church in our own generation from the televangelism scandals? Some of us are still recovering from that. And whenever a new one is uncovered or unfolded, it brings back the horrific, nightmarish experiences of old. You see, folks, as Christians, our lives are lived under the microscopic eye of the world. And nowhere is that more evident than in small-town Arizona. I've shared with you before how you can be a Christian in a big city. I've been there. We came over from Los Angeles 22 years ago. And you can just kind of hunker down and hide out, and nobody will know where you go to church, that you even claim to be a Christian, unless you got one of those little fish or one of those little doves on the back of your car. Nobody knows what you claim to be. But in small-town America, it's a different story, isn't it? They know where you shop. They know how you drive. They know where you worship. They are aware of your confession of faith. And so they're watching you. And what they see in your life tells them a lot about God and our faith. And that's why as we come to 1 Timothy chapter 3, Paul's going to turn his focus now to the leaders of the church. Because while we all live our lives under the microscopic eye of the world, folks, I want to share with you that being a leader in the church, and I know a little bit about the subject, I've been put in that position now for over 2 decades. Leadership ministry is life in a fishbowl. It really is. Everything you say, everything you do is not only watched, but it is scrutinized, it is examined, it is evaluated, and often even criticized. And such is the lot of leadership. And so, as we come to chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, understand that in the former chapter we saw Paul talking in generalities to the genders. He was talking to the men, he was talking to the women. To the men, he said, "Men, be men of prayer. Be praying men, lifting up holy hands." To the women, he said, "Women, learn. Learn quietly and in submission or subjection." And after addressing the sexes, now he kind of hones in the topic and he begins to focus more specifically upon the leadership of the church. Notice beginning in verse 1 of 1 Timothy chapter 3, where we read, "This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, but one who raises his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." And so what we see in these opening verses of this chapter really is God's criteria or God's qualifications for the leader of the church. We see listed here some 15 qualifications described in some detail as it applies to the leadership of the church. But before we consider some of them, go back to verse 1 with me, where I want you to notice something, and that is that the call into the ministry begins with a desire. Did you see that there in verse 1? Again, the apostle writes, this is a faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. You see, God's calling in our lives begins with a desire. It isn't some passing desire. It isn't a take it or leave it kind of a desire. It isn't like my desire to go to Hawaii or Tahiti, where, I know that it may never happen. But it's an unshakable desire. It's a desire that just consumes your being. And really it becomes almost a passionate preoccupation in your life. It's a desire that, listen, God will confirm in one of a couple of ways, if not both. Primarily, I believe He will confirm that desire. The confirmation will come from His Word. He will give you chapter and verse in speaking to your heart, speaking to your life, in confirming that desire, that call that He's placed in your heart. And in every church that we've been privileged to start in Arizona, God has always given us chapter and verse. 1 Corinthians 16:9 is the one that started this fellowship almost 12 years ago now, or a little over 12 years ago. Another way that God will send confirmation, that He will confirm that desire, is it may be through a word of godly counsel. Somebody at church, somebody you work with who's born again, Spirit-filled, somebody is going to minister to you a word that you're going to say, how did you know? I didn't tell anybody. And yet it's like you saw into my heart and you know what God is showing me to do. And then a third way that God will confirm that call into the ministry is He will open opportunities. We speak about how He will open doors. And God will do that. He'll open the door. He'll open the opportunity as a means of confirming that He's called us into that ministry. Now, I spelled this out specifically to you for a very particular reason, and that is too often we jump into ministry because of opportunity. We see the doors open, we see an opportunity that exists, and we really may not have the desire. And even if we do have the desire, well, we really haven't been confirmed in that desire by the Scripture or by godly counsel. But we see the opportunity, and so we're going for it. And inevitably, what will happen, I have discovered, because just look around, opportunities abound. In our community, in our country, and in the world, you will never cease to find opportunities to serve the Lord. But the question is He calling you to serve Him in that capacity, in that place, and in that time? Because I have found time and again, too often, people will jump at the opportunity and begin serving only to wear out, frustrate, and be defeated, because what happens is they haven't been called, they haven't been equipped by the Spirit, but rather they're trying to serve the Lord in the flesh in that opportunity. And anytime you serve God in the flesh, you are going to poop out, you are going to die out, you are going to be defeated. And so don't just jump at it because it's an opportunity. But pray and make sure that the Lord is calling you, filling your heart with that desire, confirming that desire from the Word and through godly counsel, and then extending opportunity and opening the door to you. And so again, Paul says this is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, and the word there for bishop in the Greek is the word episkopos, which should give us a familiar sound of a particular church denomination, because that's exactly where they get their name from, Episcopalian. You have Episcopalian churches in our community, in our country today. Later on, over in the book of Titus, when Paul is again addressing the subject of leadership, we'll get there in some weeks from now, Paul uses a different term in speaking of the leaders there, where he uses the word presbyteros. Does that have a familiar ring? We have a denomination named after them too. Presbyterians. The word translated literally means elder. And so this word for elder, this word for bishop, this word for overseer, a couple of different words are used, but it's often interchangeable. And so what Paul is talking about now is the guy that serves in the office of an elder. And listen, I got to share with you that when I was breaking my spiritual teeth, when I was first born again growing up in the faith, I thought an elder was an old person. I thought that you had to be really old to serve in this position in the ministry. And so anytime my pastor would talk about elders, I'd always look at the gray hairs in the congregation. I'm getting there, folks. And so I realized that, no, that's not what God's talking about here. I've seen some incredibly mature older folks that serve as elders, but I've seen some incredibly young, mature Christians serve as elders. One of them that is actually serving a very large Calvary Chapel affiliate in the Northwest is a young man named Peter John Corson. Took the church from his father John. I'm not sure how many number up there now. It's actually documented that the attendance at Applegate Christian Fellowship there in just outside of Medford, the number in attendance outnumbered the surrounding population of the communities. Some have actually suggested that the angels actually drop in to listen to John and Peter John teach. It could be if you've ever listened to them, because Peter John is a very young man. And sometimes I must confess that I go to conferences and I sit in teachings and I'm like, you're just a kid. I've been around the block a few times, bud. What can I possibly learn from you? And whoa, he blows my mind. He's got it, man. No, he's got it better than I've got it sometimes. He's so got the heart of God. And it's incredible to watch that eldership doesn't necessarily equate oldness. There are a lot of young people being used powerfully and mighty by God in this calling. And again, understand that a pastor must be an elder, but an elder is not necessarily a pastor. Do you follow that? We see in Ephesians chapter 4 the calling, the office of a pastor-teacher described in Ephesians 4:11 and 12. But an elder is not necessarily a pastor, but a pastor has to be an elder. And so these criteria, these qualifications apply to me every bit as much as to the elders of the ministry of Calvary Chapel. And so we're going to look at these 15 qualifications. The good news is we're not going to look at them all. We'd be here till dinner time, and as it is, we're already going to run late. So if you set your roast for noon, I'm sorry to say it's probably going to be closer to 10 after when we get out, as you saw from the first service. But we will go through a few of these. Some of them are very self-explanatory. Some of them are very obvious. But let's launch into verse 2. A bishop then must be blameless. Basically what that means is we must practice what we preach. We must walk what we talk. Nothing is more hypocritical than to say one thing and to do another. It stumbles people and it gives them, again, the wrong impression or understanding of God. But the word here literally for blameless in the Greek is a word that means that there is no proven charges. Because listen, people will accuse you and people will accuse me of all kinds of things. In the years of serving the Lord as a pastor, I've been accused of all kinds of things. But nothing is merited, nothing is proven, nothing is founded. There's no basis for any of that. That is what the word blameless here means. The husband of one wife, well, that seems simple enough, but you'll be interested to know that that's quite a controversial concept in a lot of churches. What is God saying, the husband of one wife? Some are saying, well, that means that an elder must be married, so the single people are ineligible. I disagree. Others are saying, well, it means that you can never have been divorced. Let me give you my scriptural take. First of all, when it says here the husband of one wife, understand that even as in some religious circles today, polygamy was very popular. We have our share of them up on the border between Arizona City and Arizona and Utah and the likes of those folks. And, they're a little different. But polygamy was popular in this day as well. You read in the Old Testament how they had multiple wives and concubines on the side. And, it was just incredible. And so one take on this, and I agree with this, is you can't do that. One wife. The literal Greek says a one-woman man, which was God's original creative order and design, right? Why anybody would want more than one defies understanding. Seriously. I know my wife sometimes has her hands full with me as I do with her. Why would you want to complicate that by adding to the equation? It makes no sense to me unless you're a glutton for punishment. But the other thought here is husband of one wife, meaning that if you were divorced before you came to Christ, well, you're a new person in Christ. And so what happens after you come to the faith in Jesus Christ is all a new beginning. which means that prior divorce didn't count. If you were divorced after coming to Christ as a Christian, well, then maybe that would apply to you. And so that's what the take on that particular qualification is. The next one is temperate. And as it sounds, we're talking about temperament. But we're not just talking about having a good temper, but we're talking, the word there in the Greek literally means not given to extremes. Do you know people like that? The one minute they run hot and the next minute they run cold? You feel like you're walking on eggshells around them because you never know if they're going to snap and bark at you or if they're going to, coo and cuddle with you. The extremes, and that's what it's talking about. You can't be given to extremes. Moderation would probably be the good word for that. Sober-minded. Remember the story I told about the guy who said, I'm just having a bad day? That's his impression of Christianity. There were a bunch of prune faces. And some read this word sober-minded as that's what it means. Let me share with you the comment from Warren Wiersbe on this qualification of sober-minded. He says this does not mean that he has no sense of humor or that he is always solemn or somber, but rather it suggests that he knows the value of things and does not cheapen the ministry or the gospel message by foolish behavior. Listen, preachers can have a sense of humor. I hope this one does sometimes. But I think probably the greatest example of a man who is sober-minded and yet has an incredible sense of humor, if you've ever heard him teach, if you've ever gotten to sit under his ministry, is a man named Gail Irwin. Gail Irwin has the uncanny ability of tickling your funny bone while penetrating your heart with the truth of the Word. And he does it in a way that so demonstrates the sober-mindedness, the gravity, the weightiness of the gospel. He isn't flippant. He doesn't take this stuff lighthearted, but he's able to do things with his face and his cheeks and his jowls and everything else that you just laugh at him. And yet he speaks so deeply to your heart. And so being sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. Those are all pretty self-explanatory, I think. Verse 3 goes on to say, not given to wine. And that's another controversial area. Can the leaders of the church have a glass of wine at dinner? Not given to wine. The word literally means not hanging out around the stuff. And that's why we have taken the position here at Calvary Chapel for our leadership that you don't even touch the stuff. You don't even go near. You don't even touch the stuff. Because I'm sure you're aware of the abuses of alcohol in our society today. As a former police officer, I can tell you that more than half of the calls that I responded to, be it traffic accidents, domestic violence, even criminal acts like robbery and burglary, usually involve people that were high on substance abuse. And so what the Word is saying is don't even go there. Don't even touch it. The reason being, and I've illustrated it this way before, and even had to live out this illustration Friday night. I was called away from dinner to an urgent meeting that I ended up sitting in for several hours into the night. But had I had a glass of wine or something refreshing, and God has plumbed my system to where that stuff is already distasteful. I drank once as a teenager, got sicker than a dog, and it was like God said, stay away from that stuff, Dodo. And I have ever since it. I mean, it's disgusting. And again, being a cop, I had to be around it a lot. When I was copping up in Winslow, and I think I told Matt and Christy this out at the Indian Mission the other day, I felt more like a sanitation officer than a police officer, because I was peeling the drunks out of the gutters and out of the sidewalks. And it's kind of interesting. Matt actually played drums in a bar in town that I probably broke up bar fights at the same time he was playing drums, and we didn't even know each other then. And God's taken them to Oregon and back, and they're here, and it's a small world. But I mean, I remember putting them in the backseat of my patrol car. I'd hear this. Yeah, that's exactly what. Oh God, it's like I'd be busted every light in town. Open the jail door. I'm just going to throw them in. And inevitably, no sooner would I hit the pavement of the parking lot of the cop shop, man, and I'm like, oh God. I get the trustees, the prisoners out there with the garden hose. But once that's happened in your car, the smell never really goes away. You notice that? Absolutely disgusting. It's horrible. And again, as a leader of the church, imagine calling Randy or Armour or myself or one of the leaders here to your home for prayer, maybe a crisis situation, a loved one has just died, or somebody's in the hospital and you need us to go visit, and we show up and we're like, hi, the pastor's here. And you're like, woo! I think I'll be calling the church down the street, thank you very much. Again, don't even touch the stuff is our position here at Calvary Chapel. Not given to wine, not violent. The King Jimmy uses, I believe, the word striker there. Because it's not only talking about don't punch somebody's lights out in the fisticuff sense of the word, but interestingly enough, the Greek word there is also talking about don't abuse your authority. You see, I believe that's one of the reasons that the televangelism scandals occurred the way they did. Is people obtained a level of authority, an amount of power, and then they began to abuse it or take advantage of it for their own personal and selfish gain. And it's an awesome thing to be given authority by God, because I shared with you recently how with authority comes responsibility, and the greater the authority, the greater the responsibility. Some of you bosses and managers know what I'm talking about. Some of you yearn to go back to those days of just being the peon employee around the shop so that you don't get called in with the lunches with the boss and chewed out for something you didn't do but your subordinate did, and on it goes. And so not a striker or not violent, not greedy for money. How many times have we seen people in the ministry fall behind that? I'll never forget, the Baker expose. Air conditioning their doggy's house. You know what? I mean, that's incredible. But gentle. Not quarrelsome. Note that. Not quarrelsome. We're going to get to a verse later on in our study, not this morning, but in the future, that says that the Lord's bondservant, so this really extends to all of us, the Lord's bondservant, not just the leader, but you and me, the Lord's bondservant is not to be quarrelsome. Because I don't know if you've noticed something about the dynamic of an argument. I've had a few in my days, and I know exactly what I'm talking about. Even if you walk away from that argument a winner, you're still a loser. You know why? Because you haven't shown them Jesus. You can win an argument and still lose. In fact, I've discovered that in a quarrel, in an argument, everybody loses and nobody wins. In fact, Randy has a saying that actually is pretty good when he says, the first one to the cross wins. When you have an argument, when you have a tiff, when you have a disagreement or something, don't stew on it, man. Repent. Head for the cross, because the first one at the cross is under the blood. Forgiven, cleansed, redeemed, forgiven by God. The first one to the cross wins. I like that idea. And so the leaders are not to be quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence, for if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Again, the leader's house has got to be in order. Your family's got to be together. That doesn't mean that your kid doesn't get into mischief once in a while. PKs are notorious for that. It's kind of interesting. I am only now. We had an interesting time when Randy and Laura's son, Ricky, was down visiting, because we learned. We had the three caballeros, the three amigos, the three musketeers, whatever you want to call them. The three troublemakers is what they're now being called. But as teenagers, they used to run the mountain together, and I mean, they were brothers. They shared a common faith in the Lord, but there was a love that still exists between them now that they've all grown up. Two of them are married with kids, and one's going to college. But when Ricky was down a couple of weeks ago, they were copping out. They were telling us more and more of the antics that they were guilty of doing. We learned that they'd almost set the forest on fire had it not been for a couple of 44-ounce big gulps that were handy. They were out there playing with gunpowder and blowing things up, and the next thing you know, the bush catches on fire, and they're like, yikes! We never knew that. We're hearing more and more about that. And so don't think that the pastor's family is going to be perfect. He's not, because we're all human and we're all fallible. But the pastor, the leader, needs to run his house well. And when it says there that his house, he needs to rule his own house, having his children in submission with all reverence, it doesn't mean that my kids kiss the ground that I walk on, in all submission with all reverence. Oh, the great-grand poobah's home. No, that doesn't happen around my place, okay? Usually it's like, oh, here comes Dad, head to the room, because they know they're going to get in trouble. Usually Mom's the one that says, wait till your father gets home. But, my first ministry, your first ministry, guys, is your family. Before you do anything else, your first ministry is your family. And if you can't minister well to your family, then you don't belong ministering in any other environment. I think of the story of a man named Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was a dynamic evangelist back around the turn of the last century. Literally led thousands and thousands of people to the Lord. But the tragedy of Billy Sunday's testimony is that he lost his own family in the process. Our first ministry is the home front, and don't lose sight of that. We go on, verse 6, not a novice, a new convert, a young, immature believer, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. And you know, we're guilty of doing that a lot, especially as it relates to celebrities and professional athletes and stuff. They come to the Lord, they get saved, they've got some radical testimony. We're like, whoa, shove a microphone in front of their face, give them a platform to speak. We're going to give them a speaking circuit, and they're going to go from city to city, sharing what the dramatic things that God has done in their lives. And then 6 months later, you're like, where'd they go? They drop off the scene. Because pride has filled their heart, they're taken out by the enemy, their ministry crumbles. Again, new converts, new believers are not suitable for leadership ministry for the reason that Paul says here in verse 6. And God knows our heart, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Gives us an insight as to how what the devil fell behind, huh? He got kicked out of heaven because of pride, is what we're reading here. The 5 I wills of Satan that you read about back in Isaiah chapter 14. I will ascend to be like the Most High. I will make my throne like God's. Pride filled his heart and led to his destruction. And that's why the apostle is saying, don't touch it, guys. Don't go there. Don't put a new convert, a novice, into ministry, lest they be filled with pride and fall just like the devil did. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, speaking of outside the church, outside the body of Christ, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. And simply what that means is he's got to have a good reputation. He's got to be a man of character, of integrity, and honesty. In order to be a leader in the church, you've got to have a good reputation. Not here, out there. Let's talk to your customers. Let's talk to your bosses. Let's see what they have to say about you. Because I shared with the first service, sadly, I've heard of churches that have had leaders in the ministry who did not have a good reputation in the community. They were known as brawlers. They were known as womanizers and boozers. They were known as men that never paid their bills or owed people money. And that is an immediate discredit against the gospel and the ministry that we claim to represent. And so again, you must have a good reputation with those on the outside. Now, before we go on to verse 8 and fly through the deacons, I want you to notice something about the criteria and the qualifications that God sets forth here. There's no mention of education. There's no mention of seminary or Bible college. There's no mention of degrees or certificates. In fact, with the exception of teaching, perhaps, there isn't even a mention of spiritual gifts. But everything that is described here, the qualities, the criteria, the qualifications that God outlines for the leader is based on character. Character. The making of a man of God, the inner components. You take a man of these qualities, these virtues, this character, and you will be able to educate him. God will be able to equip him. And God will be able to empower and use him. But if you're not a man of character, no matter how educated or how empowered you might be, you're going to fall short. Because somebody's going to say, you've got this deficiency in your life. You've got this weakness, this shortcoming, this failure. And so really, as this is a description of character, I can't help but think, as you've been sitting here this morning, probably thinking, well, preacher, how does this apply to me? I'm not an elder. I'm a woman, so I'll never be an elder. And on it goes. Listen, we are all to be people of character. We are all to be people of character. That's why I started this study by pointing out that our life is under the microscopic eye of the world. People are watching you and me. And if we would live but this way, if that would be the character that God works in and out of our lives as a testimony before others around us, the gospel, I believe, would spread like wildfire because people will see some virtue, some desirability in it, and it has changed our lives, and it can change yours too, and they'll just be drawn in droves to it. Quickly, let's go through verses 8 and on. Likewise, deacons must be reverent, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for money, holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. But let these also first be tested. Then let them serve as deacons, being found blameless. Likewise, their wives must be reverent, not slanderers. Interesting word, and we'll talk about it when we get back there in a moment. Temperate, faithful in all things. Let deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children in their own houses well. For those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a good standing and great boldness in the faith which is in Christ Jesus. And so now Paul shifts gears, no longer is focusing on the overseer, elder, bishop person, but now he's looking at the deacons in these verses. The Greek word for deacon is diakonos, which actually is a word that means to serve or to minister. We have some deacons in the ministry here, and that's exactly what we see them do. They oversee different aspects of the ministry as servants, as ministers. We see their office first appear in the Bible in Acts chapter 6. Remember the story? The church was growing. A dispute broke out that the Hellenist widows weren't being cared for like the Hebrew Jewish widows were. And the apostles were like, well, we really can't take care of that. Tell you what you do. Go appoint 7 men filled with the Spirit, godly in every way, blah, 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 and let them take care of the widow's needs. And that was the appearance on the scene for the first time of deacons. And we see how their qualifications in a lot of respects is very similar to that of the elders, with some exceptions. And I want to draw your attention to those exceptions right now quickly as we continue. First of all, we see in verse 8 how the deacon must be reverent, not double-tongued. Interesting word. Double-tongued. What does it mean? Have you ever heard the expression, he speaks with forked tongue? You know what that means, don't you? It means that he says one thing to somebody and another thing to somebody else and another thing to somebody else, and you never can really believe what he says. That is double-tongued. Often he's a people-pleasing speaker. He says what he thinks this person wants to hear to appease him, and what this person wants to hear to appease her, and on it goes. And he tells different things to different people just to try to be accepted and pleasant among them all. Here's what Proverbs 11:13 tells us about a double-tongued man. It says that a double-tongued man discloses the secret counsels of an assembly. Listen, a double-tongued man discloses the secret counsels of an assembly. A double-tongued man can't keep a secret. A double-tongued man can't keep a confidence. And the reason we see that the leader, the deacon here, is not to be double-tongued is because, listen, folks, things come into my ears and things will come into their ears that nobody else needs to hear or know about. There are things about this ministry that I know this morning that a lot of you don't know, and you'll never know because it's on a need-to-know basis. And I think sometimes we just try to scatter this knowledge so broadly that it really doesn't apply in every particular situation. And so a deacon has to be a man who is able to keep a confidence, is able to keep a secret. Something comes into his ear and it never leaves his lips. It comes and it stays. And I believe what God will show that person to do is to take what he's heard and lift it up in prayer to the Lord. Rather than pass it on, it's come to his attention to pray about it, to intercede for it. And so we don't want deacons to be double-tongued, again, not given to much wine. Some think that means, well, you can have a little as a deacon. Not around here. Maybe in other places, but not around here. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I took communion in a Lutheran church. And no offense to some of you Lutherans or former Lutherans that are here, but I was expecting grape juice and like, woo, that's got a zing to it. You know? And then I went to the fridge and saw, boy, it had a whole lot of zing in the fridge where the bottle was. And I'm like, whoa. You know, there's some that do that and insist that that's the way it should be. But again, I don't think that even deacons should be around this stuff. Not greedy for money, holding to the mystery of faith. That means they've got a grasp on the gospel. They understand the scriptures. They're students of the word. You can ask a deacon a question, they're not going to be caught going, blah, 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 blah. I don't know what that means. Go see the pastor. No, they should be able to answer you. They should be students of the word. And let these also first be tested. And then let them serve as deacons, being found blameless. Likewise, notice this word there is italicized in verse 11. Likewise, their wives must be reverent, not slanderers, temperate, faithful in all things. The reason the word there is in italics, I hope you know, as students of the Scripture, that anytime you come across an italicized word in your Bible, what that is denoting is that the word does not appear in the original manuscript. It is a word that was added by the translators at the time they were translating that particular version of your Bible. And so they italicize the word so that it will stand out from the rest of the word so that you know it was an addition to the original manuscript. Now here's what's interesting. I shared this with the first service. Tune in because this will benefit you in the community that we live in. Maybe you didn't know that the Book of Mormon is actually documented to contain 25,000 words, word for word, directly plagiarized from the King James Version of the Bible. Maybe you didn't know that, but you can go to any resource, Mormon or non-Mormon, and find that there are 25,000 words, word for word, in the Book of Mormon that were directly taken out of the King James Version of the Bible. Here's what's interesting. Joseph Smith, their founder, claims to have translated the Book of Mormon from golden plates that he recovered from a hill in Palmyra, New York, that were placed there by an angel named Moroni. Not macaroni, Moroni. Okay, and Joseph claims to have translated the golden plates into the most accurate book on the face of the earth, as the Book of Mormon claims to be. Here's the thing. In the 25,000 plagiarized words from the King James Bible that appear in the Book of Mormon, what they did is they took some of the italicized words with it. Those italicized words, as I just shared with you, were added in the 16th century by the King James translators when they translated the Bible. How could they have appeared in the Book of Mormon that was supposed to have been translated from golden tablets placed in the Palmyra woods back around circa AD 100 or earlier? You see where I'm going with this? Those italicized words should never appear in the Book of Mormon because they were added to the King James Bible and were just transferred there. They couldn't have come out of the original manuscript that Joseph translated it from because they were added 16 centuries later. You with me on the same page? The foundation of the Book of Mormon crumbles behind that observation. But the word here there is italicized because there's a little bit of confusion, or I'm not going to say confusion, but debate over who the apostle's actually talking to here. It could be the wives of the deacons, as some believe, and that's fine, but others believe it could actually be talking to women deacons. There are such things, I hope you know. We see one back in Romans chapter 16, verse 1. Her name was Phoebe. She was a lady deaconess. And so some believe that this could be actually the criteria, the qualifications for a deaconess, a lady deacon. And it says there that they must be reverent. But here's the interesting one. I told you we'd draw attention to it. Not slanderers. You know what that word in the literal Greek is? She-devils. Not she, yeah, one sister went, not she-devils. I mean, just the word kind of resonates a shudder through your body. Because have you ever been around a she-devil? Whoa, here it comes, hunker down, hide out. I mean, you know you're going to get it. It's a woman who can rip you apart with her tongue. She can shred you to pieces with slander and gossip and rumor and innuendo and phone calls and letter campaigns and the like. And the literal Greek word here is translated she-devils. You want to stay away from the likes of those. They're bad news, folks. I've been around a few in my lifetime. And if you're going to serve the Lord and if you're going to serve in ministry, you can't be of that spirit. Again, temperate, faithful in all things. Let deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children in their own house as well. For those who have served well as deacons, notice this, obtain for themselves a good standing and great boldness in the faith which is in Christ Jesus. Now, the reason I believe they have such a good standing is because, again, the very nature of their calling, the very nature of their ministries, they're servants, they're ministers. As servants, as ministers, they are going to be the first to hear Jesus say, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." They're going to be the first to be welcomed into the kingdom with those words, "Well done, thou good," as servants, as deacons. That is going to be music to their ears. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And so they have this good standing and great boldness in the faith. These things, as we wrap up this morning, I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. Paul wanted to come and see Tim, but it just didn't work out. But if I am delayed, I write so that you may know. And this is why he wrote this book. This is the reason for the book. Notice it, verse 15. I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, and received up in glory. As we begin to wrap up this morning, folks, the purpose that Paul wrote the letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy was so that we would know how to conduct ourselves in the house of God, how we ought to behave, how we ought to act. And so it applies to all of us, not just the guys on the platform, not just the guys with a name on the door or an office or a desk, but every one of us. How we conduct ourselves in the house of God. Which, notice this, he goes on to clarify a little further, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. The church is the pillar of the truth. We're not the foundation. Jesus Christ is the foundation of the church. The foundation is actually apostles and prophets, Jesus being the chief cornerstone. But the church is the pillar. The church is the support of the truth. And that's important to grasp hold of, folks, because we're living in a day where truth has become relative. A day where the popular saying and cliche is, well, one man's truth isn't another man's truth, therefore everybody's left to find their own truth. And I got to share with you, man, if you're left to find your own truth, you're going to find no truth. You're going to end up encountering a lie and deception. But we look at all this confusion about truth. And if the church ceases to stand as the pillar of truth, hear me on this, then we might as well all bail out of here and go down and become mooses and elks and everything else, because we've just become a social club. And that's all that we stand for anymore if we don't stand for truth. The church stands for truth, unwavering truth. Okay, what is the truth? Well, glad you asked, because Pilate cynically asked that question of Jesus back in the gospel as Jesus was on trial before Pilate. Pilate says, what is truth? And people today throw their hands up and ask you, what is truth? Jesus answered that in the high priestly prayer of John 17, when he says, Father, thy word is truth, which is why we study the Bible. Verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book. This is truth. This is unchanging. We are often accused as Christians of being too black and white. Guess what? Dad's word is black and white. Well, there's a few red spots too, but you know what I'm saying. With me, there is no gray area. It's black and white. It's either truth or it's not truth. And the church needs to stand as a pillar of that. Jesus further went on to say in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John that if you abide in my word, then you are my disciples. And you are mine, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. The truth. The church is the pillar of truth, saints. And finally, as we close, verse 16, what we see here is this mystery of godliness. He says, great is the mystery of godliness. And when Paul says great is the mystery of godliness, he's not saying great in the term and the context of, this is a puzzle that's really hard to figure out. Great. No, he's saying, great. Wow, this is sensational. This is good stuff. This is big news. Wow, this is great. Great is this mystery of godliness. And the description in the short verses to follow, watch this, is nothing more than a synopsis of the gospel. That's what it is. It's the gospel in a nutshell. God was manifested in the flesh, John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, Jesus Christ, in the flesh. God in the flesh. Justified in the Spirit. Remember Matthew chapter 3 at the baptism of John there in the Jordan, the Spirit of God came upon Jesus in the expression in the form of a dove. There you go. Justified in the Spirit. Seen by angels. Matthew chapter 4. Right after the wilderness temptation, we see how angels come and minister to the Lord. Preached among the Gentiles. Hey, isn't that the ministry of the Apostle Paul, whose letter we're reading? Believed on in the world. Hey, you and I today sitting here are proof, living proof of that. And received up in glory. You see, folks, the fact that Jesus was received up in glory was God's final stamp of approval on the work of the cross. The fact that Jesus ascended to heaven and was accepted back, received in glory, was God saying, it's done. Mission accomplished. You've done everything that you needed to do. The work was accepted by God. The ransom had been paid. The penalty had been reversed. The curse of sin against your life and mine has been undone. And we have the glorious privilege and opportunity, folks, to take that same good news to people out there, that they can be set free from their sins, that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, was justified in the Spirit, seen by angels, and preached among the Gentiles, and believed in the world. That's the message of the gospel. That's the word that we can take. And so I pray that the Lord has used this morning's message to so stir our hearts that we would do just that as we go from this place. Will you stand with me as we pray this morning?